welcome to the History Club. Next week, Dr. Ronnie Schulman will be giving a talk about Lewis and Clark and the Voyage of Discovery. And in case you didn't see it on television, come. Okay, Don is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you.
Lewis and Clark expedition.
Our speaker, Belle Rosenbloom, lived this history. As director of HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, in post-war Europe, the U.S. zone of Austria, she had the task originally of resettling DPs left behind. Many of them were there because of their security ties with the Russians. Then came the exodus, the escapees from the Soviet Union. Among them were spies planted by the NKVD. Some she suspected because they found out that she was a military dependent as well as a director of HIAS, and they would ask pointed questions about the U.S. Army. There are some she didn't know about. And since she had security clearance, the CIC opened their files and showed her the records and files of some of her clients. And they asked her help in filling in missing information. This was a little disconcerting because in reading the files, she noticed that many of these spies had blood on their hands. In addition to that, the American intelligence had also planted spies to check on her activities and how she was moving clients out to other countries. Those of you who have heard her before know you're in for an exciting presentation. So please turn off your cell phones. Questions and comments are welcomed and encouraged at the end. So let's get started.
So good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. Just give you a quick eye view as to the type of life that I lived, and of course an extension that Donald lived, because I was there courtesy of Uncle Sam. You can't hear me? Okay, it's not.
This on. The green light's there.
Is this better? Yes. So to give you a fast introduction of the type of life that we lived, you know the saying, what you seize is what you get? But in that environment, what you saw was not always true. It was represented that it was true. And a quick, fast snippet of a story to show you how it worked. Of course, one of the things that they found out was that the Governor General, who was the governor of the U.S. zone of Austria, was 4 zones at time: Russian, English, French, and U.S., of course. So he had a chauffeur. And guess what? After they investigated, they found out that the chauffeur was a Russian spy. And that's the Governor General. Well, Donald and I would travel whenever his colonel would permit, and we decided to go to Berlin. And that was early one morning before I left for the office and before he left to work in the clinic in the hospital. And he went earlier to put in the papers for permission to travel, especially to Berlin. In those days, you had to have clearance to travel there. And I went off to my office, 7:30 in the morning. Opened the door, and there was a coat rack. I hung my coat on the rack, because it was always cold there, and decided to go upstairs. We shared the building. Downstairs was HIAS, which is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which was responsible for the migration schemes, and upstairs was what was known as the Joint Distribution Committee, who gave them their monthly stipend. They supported these people because obviously they're stateless and they didn't have any money. By the time I came back down, I walked into my office maybe 10 minutes later, and I noticed that on the sleeve of my coat there was a white sheet of paper with a pin, pinning it on, and in a script it was written, "Enjoy your trip to Berlin." And that, my friends, was our world. Okay.
Enjoy the trip to Berlin.
Let's see. Today we're dedicating this, as Donald did last week, to Lenny Levine, in gratitude for his encouragement, friendship, and spectacular introductions, primarily, I must be honest, for myself, because he knew the type of work I had been engaged in, and he, in a sense, was very complimentary and appreciative. So, now, this, my friends, to use a very trite saying, the topic of American traitors who betrayed our country to Russia, to China, and at the end we will see one on Al-Qaeda. But the New York Times decided to be very kind to us, and last Wednesday, the lead article on the front page of the New York Times is FBI detains man, it says betrayed US spies in China. And so, if you read the article, you know that it tells you that the name of the fellow was Lee, and he had worked for the CIA, got a little disillusioned, became very involved with China. He was a nationalized citizen, and he had repeated contacts with the Chinese intelligence, both on an official level while working for the agency in Beijing, and afterward, under circumstances his business associates found deeply suspicious, according to a former colleague. And as we go on to the article, we see that they found that there was the destruction by the Chinese security agencies of the CIA's operations inside the country, including the imprisonment and execution of a dozen Chinese nationals secretly working for the United States. And you know, that's how the world goes with covert missions. If that's destroyed, a lot of our intelligence is destroyed. It is considered one of the most devastating intelligence setbacks for the agency in recent decades. With Mr. Lee's arrest and the continuing investigation, inquiries at the CIA and the FBI into how did this unfold and what mistakes were made to likely go on for years. Now, the charge that he has been given carries a maximum sentence of 10 years. It relates to Mr. Lee's possession in 2012 of 2 notebooks that contain the identity of Chinese nationals working for the CIA and other highly classified details. Mr. Lee's repeated contacts with the Chinese intelligence would be of great relevance to the question of whether he may have been recruited by China and played a role in the betrayal of the CIA secrets. So during the early years of the investigation into the loss of so many sources in China, there were disagreements, and not unusual, as we go on you'll see, between the CIA and the FBI over whether Mr. Lee was the likely source of the breach. Some investigators believed China may have penetrated the CIA's covert communications or sloppy trade clash. You will hear about sloppy trade clash also. So, if we can move on, yeah. Let's This tells you all about Mr. Lee, and those who want can read the paper too. This is just a list of enemies who have spied for our enemies from the CIA. Those with the red dot, if you can delineate it, are the ones that we will be discussing. There are many. These are the ones that we selected. These are ones who worked in CIA, NSA, Armed Forces, others. Today we will be discussing Aldrich James, Morris Cohen, Robert Hansen, Harold Nicholson, John Walker, Henry Dexter White, Larry Wu Tai Chin, very interesting guy, and the latest, Adam Yahin Gaden. The first one is one that you will all be familiar with, Aldrich James. It is said that Aldrich James caused more damage to the national security of the U.S. than any spy in the history of the CIA. He was a walking breach of security through sheer inefficiency and incompetence on the part of the CIA and FBI. You heard that before. He began working for the CIA in a trainee program in high school and stayed on until he was discovered to be a double agent. He specialized in selling identities of CIA agents placed within the KGB, the agents, to the KGB, sold them back. And the damage he caused, U.S. intelligence efforts cannot be known, but conservative estimates indicate that he exposed over 100 agents and was directly responsible for at least 10 deaths. A thorough accounting of his finances revealed that he and his wife made over $4.6 million over the course of their espionage career. Everyone has a career. Ames explained the full extent of his activities as part of a plea bargain to mitigate his wife's sentence, rather gallant, I would say. As a result, Ames was sentenced to life in prison while his wife received 63 months. When he was stationed in Turkey, he targeted the Russian KGB for recruitment. He was trained in the Russian language, spoke it fluently, and he specialized for the CIA, ostensibly, in Russian intelligence service and in the KGB. However, he had a severe drinking problem. And through the years, although his colleagues were aware, it was never fully reported, even though he would pass out dead drunk at parties and at various places, and one never knew what he would say and give out when he was dead drunk. So these were very serious offenses because he worked in a very sensitive Soviet East Division. At one point, he became divorced, and he needed money desperately to pay all his debts. So he thought perhaps he'll go off to the Soviet embassy, he'll trade some secrets, and it will be a one-time thing. But you know, my friends, when you taste ice cream that's delicious, and even though you tell yourself that I'm only going to have one spoonful, you know you're going to have more. So in Rome, he worked in Italy, again studied the language, and he was known to have carried out packages of information. That is not allowed, it's not allowed to leave. In November of '89, they started to check him and found that he is living beyond his means. But after checking him in the 90s, they signed off. And their investigation of Ames, they flubbed. In 1992, they vetted Ames' financial records, his credit cards, and bank records. He claimed that his lady friend was by the name of Rosario, came from a very wealthy family in South America, and that's how he received all of this money and he was able to live. He compromised 30 agents. He did incalculable damage. And this was because of greed and money. Some, you will see, did it out of ideology. So let's meet our next candidate who did it out of ideology. This is Morris Cohn and his wife Leona. He is also known by the alias of Peter Kroger. He was an American convicted of espionage with the Soviet Union, and his wife Leona was also an agent. Not quite that saying, the family that prays together stays together. I assume that the family that spies together stays together. So Morris Cohn was born in Harlem, in New York City, in 1910. His father came from Kiev in present-day Ukraine. His mother came from Vilnius, present-day Lithuania. And he was a standout football star at James Monroe High School in the Bronx. Guess where I went to high school? You guessed it. James Monroe High School in the Bronx. Thank God he wasn't there. And after briefly attending the university, he was awarded an athletic scholarship to Mississippi A&M, which is now Mississippi State University. He did not do well. He transferred to the University of Illinois, and there he became active in a group called Agrit Prop, and he worked for the National Student League, which was a communist front. And he was at that point declared persona non grata. And he was thrown out. He was in the Army. After the Army, he received a master's degree in education from Columbia University. He did in 1937, and this is the beginning of it, join the Foreign National Volunteers in the Spanish Civil War, and he was influenced very strongly by a patriot called Amado Sabatini, who was a veteran Korea Soviet spy. So he was injured, he returns to the United States. In 1942, he is drafted into the U.S. Army and served in Europe. And when he comes back, he resumes his espionage for the Soviet Union. In 1954, they moved to England, and they masquerade as antique dealers, and they live on a street. I don't know those. I know London well. I'm not familiar with 45 Cranley Drive in Ruslip, and they had numerous pieces of disguised spy equipment and an antenna looping around their attic, used for their transmission to Moscow. In the British security were suspicious. They arrested the Cohns in 1961 for their part in a network known as the Portland Sky Ring that penetrated none other than the Royal Navy, and Morris and Leona received 8 years in prison. In 1967, the Soviet Union admitted that the Cohns were spies, and Britain exchanged them for Gerald Brooke, a British subject. Notable examples of the exchange, which you will all be familiar with, is the Soviet spy Rudolph Wilson's Labor government was criticized for the opposition for agreeing to release dangerous Soviet agents like Peter and Helen Kroger. So you know that they exchanged the Soviet spy, we did, Rudolph Abel, if you saw the film with Tom Hanks, for the U-2 pilot, Gary Powers. The Cohns returned to Mexico, where he continues to train younger colleagues who are his intelligence gathering. During the period there, he was always an employee of the Russian spy unit. After training Soviet agents, well, where am I going? I want to show you the stamp. After training Soviet agents, they were awarded the highest honor and placed on the stamps in Russia. How much better can you do for a nice boy from the Bronx? That's from James Monroe High School, where he was awarded the major award, to Red Square. He really succeeded. Okay. Now we move on to one which I'm sure you're all familiar with. You have seen the movie. And he is such an interesting character. Morris Cohn, of course, you realize, did it for ideology. We have our friend Robert Hansen. Robert Hansen is a former FBI agent who spied for the Soviet Russian intelligence services against the United States for 22 years, 1979 to 2001. During his espionage career, Hansen compromised scores of investigations and operations, including the surveillance of the suspected mole Felix Bloch, and completed an eavesdropping tunnel directly under the Soviet embassy decoding room. But there were leaks to the USSR, and that's what he gave of every KGB agent contacting the FBI. And he conveniently identified and detected double agents and prospective defectors alike. The FBI was so flummoxed at finding Hansen that at the end they had to buy the information to put him away. They could not find who could do this to them. He had a name. His name was Ramon. They knew there was Ramon, but the Soviets didn't know who he was. He would supply everything by putting it in a bag, putting a white piece of tape on under a bridge, or by a mailbox that was no longer used. And at some point, they gave him all the money. He sold his services to the GRU, which was the Soviet military intelligence, and he would do this via these dead letter drops. And he would pinpoint Soviet traders, sell their ID to the Soviets and the KGB officers. He gave up one of the most important source for us by the name of Tofat. He was a Soviet agent for 20 years who passed the information on to the FBI. He also gave up General Dmitry Polakov, and the FBI was baffled. This was at the same time that Ames was betraying us in the CIA. The FBI started to study and looking for all possible penetrations, and Hansen was in charge, looking for himself. So he gave up nuclear deployment plans. He gave 6,000 pages to the Soviet Union. Strangely enough, he stopped for 7 years. And they started to look furiously, and they saw that all these lines were leading to this mole. And as I said before, they had to give it up and buy it from the Soviet Union. Now, the most unique thing about Hansen was that he was a devout Catholic. And he was very enamored of the Opus Dei division of Catholicism and the priests. And they looked for a very pure world, no abortion, no divorce. straight married life and such. At one point, he was up over his head and decided that he would go to confession, but he strongly supported the Opus Dei, and he went to an Opus Dei priest, confessed to him what he was doing and making all this money. And the priest listened to him and said, "I tell you what to do. Pass it on to the Mother Teresa charities. And then, guess what? It is a confessional. The secret remains in the confessional." But he also liked to play around a little bit. So this very devout fellow who went to church every day and put a silver cross above his desk and sent 6 children by means of all this money to the best Catholic schools, had a friendship for a couple of years with a stripper. I don't know if it was quite in the Opus Dei regulations. And so he bought her a Mercedes and jewelry. And guess what? Yay for the dentist. He fixed her teeth, too. And finally, the FBI was able to capture him when he put one of his drops, and he found he couldn't get the note. He went back to see why couldn't he get it, and he was checking it, and they came out from the area around the trees and such. And he had the strongest ego. He was smart. And he said, "What took you so long?" So we move on to Harold Nicholson. He was the highest CIA officer ever charged with spying. He was a double agent, and he became the first person convicted of betraying his country twice. He was known as Batman, and guess what? He collected a pension from Russia for service during the 60s. And he took, this is the first betrayal, he took $300,000 from the Malaysian government when he was there. Jack Nicholson pled guilty to conspiring to act as an agent of the
Harold, not Jack.
Harold, otherwise known as Jim. Sorry. Jim, Jack, whatever. As someone once said to me, they kept on calling me Rosenberg, and it was something that had to be for insurance policy. I said, no, the name is Rosenbloom, and if you do not write it correctly, we will have a problem further down the road with this application. And this chief of police in Providence, Rhode Island said, what's the difference? Rosenberg, Rosenbloom, you're all the same. Thank you. So here, Harold Nicholson pled guilty to conspiring to act as an agent of the foreign government and laundering money. He orchestrated, though, this was good family cohesion. He orchestrated a plot to use his son Nathan to sneak messages while he was already in federal prison in Oregon to Russian intelligence agents and collect a pension for his illicit service in Russia in the 1990s. He was named Batman in his 16-year career with the CIA. Nicholson is the highest-ranking CIA officer ever convicted as espionage. His son Nathan pleaded guilty for his role in the plot. He traveled to 3 continents to collect payments from Russian officials still indebted to his father for his past espionage. Jim Nicholson passed crumple notes to Nathan, as we said, during the visits in their minimum security prison, and he told them where to carry them to the Russian officials. And he went to San Francisco, Mexico City, rather dutiful son, wouldn't you say? Lima, Peru, Nicosia, Cyprus, collecting cash from Russian officials, $47,000 according to court records. So he really sought the money to make the lives of his family during his imprisonment easier. What a dutiful father he was. Nicholson kept close contact with his parents who lived in Oregon, and he was an upstanding, wonderful person. He began his troubles in '94. He was the CIA's deputy chief of station in Kuala Lumpur, in Malaysia, and he then became involved in a messy divorce and wanted to get custody of his children. And guess what? Here we have it again, the need for money. He needed money. So he began selling U.S. secrets to the Russian intelligence official, trotting the globe and hand off documents. In exchange, the Russians paid him $300,000. He did fail in '95 a routine polygraph exam. It showed he appeared to be deceptive on questions about his contacts with foreign intelligence officers. The FBI and CIA together quietly began to investigate Nicholson. He was sent back to the States to teach spycraft at their training unit in Virginia. They moved him to a desk job, and they secretly captured videotape of Nicholson shooting photos of classified documents in his office. They arrested him in '96 at Dulles International Airport, where he was carrying 10 rolls of films that he intended to give to the Russians. He faced charges that carried the death penalty, but he cut a deal, pleading guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage in exchange for a reduced sentence. And now we meet John Walker. In 1967, the Navy communication officer John Walker snuck straight in to the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and offered to sell them secrets. He handed over, this is amazing, the settings for the KL-47 cipher machine, which decoded sensitive U.S. Navy messages. His motivations were purely financial, and he proved to be a bargain. Over the next 17 years, Walker gave the KGB the location of all American nuclear submarines, as well as the procedures the U.S. would follow to launch nuclear missiles at the Soviet Union in the event of the war. So, therefore, the Soviets learned the locations of underwater microphones tracking Soviet nuclear submarines. Moreover, KGB agents learned of every American troop and air movements in Vietnam from 1971-73 and passed this on to their enemies, or our enemies, of course, including the planned sites and times for the U.S. airstrike against North Vietnam. So, according to Vitaly Yushchenko, a KGB defector, it was the greatest case in KGB history. He said, "We deciphered millions of your messages, and if there had been a war, we would have won it." Okay. Now we meet, and so each one you see worked in a different area. Now we meet Harry Dexter White, who was an American economist and a senior U.S. Treasury Department official. He worked very closely with the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr., and he set American financial policy for the Allies in the Second World War. At the same time, he passed numerous secrets to the Soviet Union. He was the senior American official at the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference that established the post-war economic order. He's the one who set that up. He dominated the conference and imposed his vision of post-war financial institutions over the objections of the British representative. At Bretton Woods, White, Harry Dexter White, was a major architect of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And he testified before the committee, and he denied being a communist. After he finished testifying, he had a heart attack. He left for his home in New Hampshire. He had another heart attack, and he died at the age of 55. They claimed that it was an overdose of digitalis. His guilt was later confirmed by the declassified FBI documents and related to the interception and decoded of Soviet communications. This was well known as the Venona Project. So there is no question of treachery in the accepted sense of betraying one's country's secrets to an enemy, but there can be no doubt that in passing classified information to the Soviet Union, he knew he was betraying his trust, even if he did not thereby think he was doing it against his country. Now we meet Larry Wu Tai Chin, who was a Chinese translator working for the CIA. He sold classified documents to China from 1952 to 1985. He served as a Chinese translator in the U.S. Army during the Korean War, at which time he came into contact with Chinese intelligence. He supplied the Chinese with information about prisoners of war that were captured by the American, South Korean, and Allied forces. He misrepresented the intelligence that he was translating, resulting in the loss of U.S. forces and missed tactical opportunities at that point. Many of these Chinese soldiers intended to defect to South Korea. He also provided the Chinese with the names of captured Chinese soldiers who were revealing information because they intended to defect. The Chinese then specifically requested these soldiers by name be released back to China before the armistice negotiations could take place. This delayed the negotiation process for over a year, resulting in countless lost lives. He had great skill at laundering, espionage, money. He made lots and lots of money. So he reputed to be, his skills were reputed to be without peer. And since he had a lot of money and he knew how to invest, Chin purchased apartments and tenements. He purchased apartments and tenements in Baltimore, Maryland, and he made huge gains as a slumlord. He also cultivated the persona of a womanizer with a gambling addiction. So he used this cultivated persona of a high roller to help cover his unexplained affluence from the espionage as purely gambling winnings. Not once during Chin's tenure in the Army or CIA was he suspected of espionage or placed under investigation. In fact, in 1980, Chin was awarded a medal from the CIA for his long and distinguished service. So the first espionage count against him accused him of having conspired with the Chinese intelligence agents to transmit defense-related documents potentially damaging to the U.S. interests and naturally advantageous to those of China. The second count was that charged Chin specifically having transmitted to a foreign agent in 1952 information about the location of prison camps in Korea where Chinese prisoners were held. So Chin was sentenced to a lengthy prison term for espionage and, all our accountant friends will be very happy, tax evasion. Chin admitted to this espionage, but he claimed that his deeds were intended to pursue a reconciliation between the United States and China. He showed little remorse for his activities. He said, that prison was a small price to pay. Prison was a small price to pay in exchange for improving the lives of 1 billion Chinese who benefited from a closer relationship with the United States. Yes. And so now we move on to the last. Adam Yahin Gadan. Adam was an American-born convert to Islam. Adam Yahin Gadan, aka Azam the American, threatened a terrorist attack on Los Angeles in 2005 in an Al-Qaeda video. As a full-on member of their media committee, Gahan served Al-Qaeda as a translator, a video producer, a cultural interpreter, and a spokesman. His zeal in their propaganda was cartoonish in its intensity, but very real. After Al-Qaeda leader Ayman Zawahiri endorsed his videos, some of which referred to the United States as enemy soil, the Justice Department indicted Gahin as the first American accused of treason since World War II. It is widely believed that Azam the American is now Azam the dead American, following reports that he was killed by a Predator drone in January 2008. So now, if you're wondering what that is, the rose is a symbol of secrecy, dating back to ancient Egypt and Rome. The Latin phrase sub rosa, or under the rose in English, is used to denote secrecy or confidentiality. The rose now is used, and through history has been used by many nations as a badge of intelligence and security and spying. So my friends, if somebody hands you a rose, be very suspicious. All right, I'm happy to answer any questions, tell you any other stories, whatever you would like.
Yeah, I have.
Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. After the Korean War ended, 1,000 American prisoners of war were taken north into Manchuria,
Yes.
and they disappeared. We never heard from them again. And I wonder if you want to comment about that. Did you know anything?
Well, it was standard. Here you saw with, Larry Chu and such, and the first one, yes, Larry Wei Tu Chin, who, spied obviously for the Chinese and such. And you know that the last sentence I said was that they held up the armistice agreement because they wanted their people back. So it's not unusual that they would do that, and they would take them.
Yeah.
But it is also classic that the Japanese kidnapped a lot of Koreans way back when and brought them to Japan, and it wasn't until recently that they were reunited with their families, so that they were not heard from again. Classic standard and such. Yes.
Yeah. In the context of all these post-World War II,
Yes.
1940s and 50s treasonous situations, would you
Yes.
comment on the validity, not the methodology, for instance, of Senator McCarthy's hearings?
Well, those of us who lived through that era, I believe if you remember the terminology, it was called a witch hunt. Now, these are to the best of my knowledge and the research and the books that I've read, these are documented people that they followed. You heard how many years it took for the FBI and the CIA to find these people. The difference was, and that opens up a complete Pandora's box for you, the difference in the McCarthy era and such was that if perhaps you were associated went to a meeting when you were at college and it happened to be a speaker from the Communist Party, then Roy Cohn, who was his lawyer, jumped on it and said, as they said in the trial of Dreyfus, j'accuse. They accused you. But here they investigated and they look. I don't know how much investigation they did then, but it was entitled a witch hunt. This is not a witch hunt.
No, I'm
This
not
is
saying this is a witch hunt. I'm saying he was obviously looking at significant damage being done to the United States. Our nuclear program was being
Yes.
copied. Leaks were going out, military positioning and everything. There must have been a knowledge that they have a leaky boat.
More than likely there could be. Depends. Go ahead, yes.
Do you know if they've changed any of the protocols at all in the CIA or the FBI so that...
Please say that again.
I said, do you know if they've changed any protocols so that, I mean, these things went on for years.
For years.
It's not like, oh, somebody did it for a year and they caught them. They've been 20
Well,
years.
Hansen, his ego, and he was so brilliant.
Right,
that they
right,
couldn't
but I'm
get.
just saying, you know,
But-
like now, do they administer more, tests?
I assume that
you
they
know?
have, but it's going on all the time. If it went on in my
Yeah,
time,
that's-
and it's now 2018, and we're tracing all of these people through all the years, everybody looks to expand and to, improve, but that's it, Lowell.
Just to give you an example, I have a couple of questions, but how inept McCarthy was, is a teacher in Woodbury, New Jersey, who was against the Korean War, Vietnam War.
Yes.
They subpoenaed her before the committee. She was
Yeah.
about 70 years old.
Yeah.
She comes to the committee before McCarthy says to Cole, why'd you get here? He tells her, what do you mean, Gary? Let her go home. We don't need that, because she's against the war, she's not a communist. She went back to Woodbury and they fired her from her job because she was subpoenaed.
Well,
That's how
of
inept
course,
he was.
she was tainted at that
Yeah.
point,
The
unfortunately.
question I have, they killed the Rosenbergs,
Yeah.
but these people killed more people than the Rosenbergs did.
As a matter of fact, Leona Cohn worked for the Manhattan Project, and she did much more damage
yeah.
in stealing the information than the
My
Rosenbergs
question
did.
is, two questions. Why is the United States so lenient with these people, where in other countries they'd be beheaded, killed right away? Oh, we'll give you jail, and then we have to pay millions of dollars to keep them in jail. Second of all, is the Russian and Chinese agencies that inept as we are? China and that, as inept as the Americans are?
I'm sure they're going to say they're not.
They're not
Yes,
gonna
go
tell
ahead.
you.
The reason that they give them lenience is because they cooperate
Yes.
and they turn in their...
Yeah, well, I'm sure these other people
Yeah.
cooperated too, but
And the same way we had traders, the Chinese and the Russians have them too. We don't have monopoly on traders.
Yeah.
Going
Howard.
further back to the Spanish Civil War, the people that you designated as communists were really anti-Nazis. The Nazis were on the other side. They were supplying the loyalists with weapons to fight the communists, who were the real loyalists for the Spanish government. You have
Yeah.
to bring that out.
Yeah, well, that was the Spanish Civil War.
The
That's-
Spanish Civil War was
Yeah,
a unique
but
situation.
that was, he was a member of Morris Cohn. That's why we mentioned the Spanish
Yes, but they
Civil War, but
they
it's
were
not
trying
within
to
our
expose the
realm
Nazis.
today, Howard. Yeah. Oh, they like me a lot. Yes. Okay. Any other? Yes, sir.
Did you ever see the television program, The Americans,
Yes.
about a planted
Yes.
Russian? Do you ever,
Yes.
in your
Yes.
research, have you seen anything of that
Based on a
magnitude?
true story.
Yeah.
I'm sure that it has a modicum of truth to it.
They say it's.
Everyone operates that. There isn't any country, if you go back even to the Bible, it always, they masqueraded and such, and what they really are. Lou?
We didn't touch on the election with President Trump.
Another speaker, another day.
Influence. How many spies from Russia influenced the election for President Trump?
It is a going on, you're right. It's, it's a 24/7 story. Watch cable news and you'll know, and the problem is, we still aren't to the bottom of it. No collusion! Yes.
They were saying too, people say about this banning the UN and everything, but I'm sure there's the biggest spy agency working in the UN, spying on every other country that's there.
Absolutely.
That's the biggest spy place.
Well, anything else?
Yeah, well, we have CIA agents all over the world, spying all over the world.
Of course. Yeah.
We do
That's how it
as well as
works.
they do.
I mean, those of you who are devotees of Daniel Silva, read his books. You'll see that setup shows you it's a mirror image. Not quite of ours, although he does mention Gray and Seymour and the safe houses and such all over. So if there are no other questions, we better